Well, before we kick things off, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Kellen Wilson. I'm the marketing coordinator here at Livingtree. And welcome to our webinar today. It's going to be a good one. I'm really excited for this topic, especially following our previous webinar. But I will let Gary get into some of those details. So he's going to moderate the webinar for us. So Gary, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Kellen, and welcome, family. We're excited to have you here. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I know it's the end of the school year, or pretty close to the end for most of you. And so the fact that you would spend some time with us today to talk about this important topic is our honor. So thank you. Couple housekeeping items. As you know, just off the top, the webinar is something we do in kind of a series of webinars that we do, and the purpose of this is we understand that technology is a vehicle and not a driver, and so we want to bring the best of the best content and resources to our family, and part of that is this important topic of home visits. So with that, for those of you, a couple housekeeping items, all registrants will receive a recording of this 24 hours after the conclusion of the webinar today. Kellen will get that out to you. Feel free to share that with others when you do get that. If you're going to be on Twitter, you can engage with us at #EngageWebinar, and Kellen will be moderating that. And then down at the bottom, there's a little chat feature. We used to have to explain this, but I know everybody knows how to use Zoom at this point. So submit your questions throughout the webinar, and I will be moderating that portion of it. I will take all those questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can at the end. The last 10 to 15 minutes we'll save for Q&A. Our previous webinars that we had, Kellen has a page where all of these live, but shifting from a school-centric to family-centric approach. Last month, we had a great conversation with Dr. George Ortero and a fresh look at building parent partnerships in schools. And we are so excited to have Gina Martinez-Keddy and Gretchen Viglione with us to talk about home visits and building strong relationships with families. So I read a little bit of their bio before we get started, and then I'll turn it over to Gina and Gretchen. Gina Martinez-Keddy is the Executive Director of Parent Teacher Home Visits, acronym is PTHV, worked as a community organizer from 1997 through 1999 with parents and other organizers to help launch PTHV in Sacramento, California, then rejoined PTHV as the Executive Director in June 2017. In their intervening years, she continued her community organizing career across California, serving as the Executive Director of Congregation Organizing for Renewal and Orange County Congregation Community Organizations. Gretchen Viglione is the Parent Teacher Home Visits Training Specialist in Sacramento City Unified School District. She manages the PTHV program for 40 PTHV sites across the district. Gretchen is certified as a certified national trainer for PTHV and has trained educators in both in-person home visits and virtual bridge visits, which is part of what we're going to talk about today. She taught elementary school for 19 years in SCUSD, where she became an advocate for home visits. Gretchen earned her master's from Portland State University. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to both of you and have this conversation about home visits, one that we talk about every year, but this year in particular, what an interesting story. So I can't wait for you to hear it. And with that, Gina, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Gary. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We're super excited to be here. So I'm going to be talking about parent-teacher home visits as kind of the national perspective and giving you a little bit of background about our history and the basics of our model. But I always say it's always so much more powerful and interesting to hear how this work gets actually lived out in a local community. And so Gretchen is going to be sharing about how they implement this model, parent-teacher home visits model, in Sacramento, California. So To get started though, I think, at its core, parent-teacher home visits is all about building relationships of trust between families and educators. And we do that by providing training to schools and school districts and educators on how to implement this model of home visits. Now, we always say that we certainly did not invent home visits. There's all kinds of different kinds of home visits that happen, but we do have a unique model of home visits. And the purpose of it is, again, really to focus on building those relationships of trust and knowing that ultimately, when you have that foundation, lots of other good things are going to come out of it. So a little bit about our history. We were born out of community organizing, as you heard a little bit in my bio, in the late 90s in Sacramento, California. And we were working with a small number of public school parents and a small number of public school educators, both of whom knew very well, as the entire community did, that there was a real breakdown of trust and communication between them. And as a result, students were falling through the cracks and students were not getting what they needed from schools. And so it turned out that a couple of those teachers that we were working with at the time, they were actually doing home visits kind of informally on their own without any kind of model or training, but they were seeing some really incredible results in terms of partnering with families to support students in school. And so this group of parents and teachers decided that they really wanted to systematize that practice of home visits throughout the school district. And so they formed a partnership with the local teachers union, who was on board from day one, with the school district and with this community organization. And together they developed the budget, got the funding, they developed the model and put together the training, and were able to train a bunch of educators in Sacramento on how to do these home visits. And they were able to launch the pilot project in 1998 with 8 schools in one neighborhood in Sacramento. And I think back in those years, I don't think that anybody would have imagined that today parent-teacher home visits would have a presence in 28 states plus Washington, D.C., and that last year alone, our home visitors from across the country conducted more than 45,000 home visits. But we have grown significantly over the years, and a lot of that is through word of mouth, because people just hear about the great work that's happening and the results that come out of it. And so what is this model of home visits that I keep referring to? What you see here are what we call our 5 non-negotiable core practices. And we always say that if you want to practice the parent-teacher home visit model, that these are the 5 things that we really ask you to stick to. These are the 5 things that no matter what, we want to make sure these are happening. And outside of these 5 things, there's a whole lot of flexibility to really adapt this model to your local community. So I'm just going to run through these pretty quickly. The first one is that visits are voluntary for all. And so that means they're voluntary for educators and they're voluntary for families. Because the purpose of these home visits are really about building relationships of trust, we believe that if anybody were mandated or required to do these visits, it would kind of defeat the purpose a little bit of building that trust. So they're always voluntary. The second core practice is that educators are trained and compensated. I mentioned earlier that parent-teacher home visits does provide that training to educators for how to use this model. But we also want to make sure that our school or school district partners, that they have developed the budget and that they have identified the funding so that educators can get compensated for their home visit time. And that idea really came, that was really important to our founding parents, because the parents realized that teachers were asked all the time to do things that were outside of their workday and that they weren't really getting paid for it. And so our founding parents wanted to make sure that home visits did not become one more of those things that teachers had to do without getting paid. So the third core practice here is that we share hopes and dreams. So in the first home visit, we always ask the educators to ask the question, what are your hopes and dreams for your child? And we ask them also to be prepared to answer that question. What are the educators' hopes and dreams for that same child? And as you can imagine, that begins to open up a whole different kind of conversation where families and educators, maybe they begin to realize that maybe their hopes and dreams are not that far apart from each other, and that maybe they can partner together as co-educators to begin to realize those hopes and dreams. And then the fourth core practice is that we don't target students. So we don't target individual students, and we don't target groups of students. This model is really designed to benefit all students. And so it's not just for the students that are chronically absent. It's not just for the students that might be struggling academically, or it's not just for students that are thriving, right? So it's really designed to benefit all students. And if a teacher is not able to visit all of their students, then we definitely recommend that they visit a representative cross-section of their students. And then the last core practice is that educators go in pairs and reflect. And so going in pairs really started from the very, very beginning. And it was a way to address, I think, a lot of educators who had never done home visits before. And so, of course, they were uncertain about it. They were a little uncomfortable about it. You know, what if I mess up? You know, what if the family doesn't really want me in their home? Lots of different discomforts around doing home visits. And so going in pairs really provided that sense of security that I think sometimes we all need when we're trying something new. But it gave that educator someone else that they knew was going to have their back and was going to support them during this process of home visiting. But what we learned over the years is that going in pairs also had an additional benefit, and that was that the two educators could reflect together after the home visit to think together about, you know, what did they learn about that student? What did they learn about the family? What did they learn about themselves or their school? And how can they take those learnings back and apply them into in the classroom to support the learning and the academic or social emotional wellness of that child. So it's taking that home visit and really applying it to the learning for that child. Okay, so those are the 5 non-negotiables. The other piece about our model that I wanted to share is that we have a 2-visit model. And so the first visit is really focused on that hopes and dreams conversation. It is all about establishing that relationship and building that trust right off the bat. That is the purpose of that visit. And these first home visits can happen at any time during the school year. We've seen first visits happen in kind of March, April, May, and they're very successful first visits. But a lot of schools like to do their first visits either over the summer or right at the beginning of the school year so that they can really start off that new school year with that relationship already in place. So that's the first visit. And then following that first visit, it opens up a lot of kind of informal modes of conversation between parents and educators, because they both feel much more confident and much more comfortable in reaching out to each other to share different pieces of information about what might be going on in the classroom or what might be going on at home that might impact what's going on in the classroom, and just kind of keeping each other informed about what's going on with that child and how they can work together to support that child. And then the second formal visit, again, can happen anytime after the first visit, but oftentimes schools like to do it in the winter or spring. And the second visit can be a continuation of the hopes and dreams conversation, but it can also be a little bit more focused on something like academics. Maybe there's testing coming up and the second visit helps prepare the student and the family for testing. Or maybe the second visit helps prepare them for the transition into the next grade level, right? So there can be different focuses for that second home visit. oops, I went one too far. And so another question that we get from this, from our work is, so how do I know that this really works, right? How does building a relationship really end up making a difference for students and for educators and families? So over the course of our history, we've done a number of different research studies throughout the years, and they've shown things like decreased suspensions and expulsions, increased rates of applying to 2- and 4-year colleges, definitely increased trust and empathy among parents and educators who really see themselves as co-educators. And then about a couple of years ago now, we completed a national evaluation of our work across 4 school districts across the country. It was conducted by Johns Hopkins University and RTI International. And a couple of things that they found. One of them was that the home visits really helped the parents and the educators begin to shift their mindsets about each other. And so, you know, the home visit and just kind of sitting down and having that meaningful conversation with another human being really helps to helps them identify and begin to disrupt some of their biases that they might have held about each other, or some assumptions that they might have held about each other, and creates that opportunity for them to work more closely together. And then for students, the research from Johns Hopkins showed that there were, for students that had home visits, there were definitely decreases in chronic absence rates. There were increases in academic performance, particularly around ELA testing. And so that was great news for the students that received home visits. But the other thing that was really great news and a surprise to us was that the research also found that for schools that implemented this model with at least 10% of their students, they saw those same changes in chronic absence and academic performance. They saw those changes at the whole school level as well. So even for students that did not receive a home visit, they also saw those changes. And so I think it really speaks to the power of this model to not only change individual lives, but to also have the potential to change entire schools and maybe even entire school districts. So that's kind of some of the evidence behind this model and how it works. So when we do our 3-hour training, we spend quite a bit of time helping people identify what might be some of the barriers that would keep them from doing home visits. And so today, obviously, we're not doing the full training today, but I do just want to mention some of them because it is important to address things, because when you start thinking about going out and doing home visits, of course, there's going to be questions about how to do it and how to make it work. So one of the potential barriers that we hear about quite often is around time. And of course, we all know that teachers have so much on their plates, and how in the world are they supposed to carve out more time to do home visits? So we always tell educators to be very intentional about their time with home visits. Set aside some blocks of time that work for them to do home visits, and don't let home visits kind of creep into other parts of your professional life or your personal life, but just be very intentional about the time that you do set aside for home visits. And the other thing is to look at, are there things on your plate now that you might be able to take off at least temporarily so that you can do home visits, knowing that down the line, doing those home visits might actually save you some time later on with classroom management or instruction or trying to connect with families or other things. So that's one of the potential barriers. Another one is mandated reporting. So a lot of times we get the question, I'm a teacher, I'm a mandated reporter, and if I see something reportable, I need to report it. So what happens if I see something during a home visit? And the answer is, of course, if you see something that is reportable during a home visit, you follow your school and your district protocols to report it for sure. But also we encourage people to go into the home visit knowing and being very clear about what kinds of things are in fact reportable. So for example, poverty is not reportable, right? And so be very clear about what's reportable. The other thing on this one is that our visits are never drop-in visits. They are always scheduled ahead of time. And so the family knows you're coming. And so families don't want to get reported, right? So if by chance there is something going on, they're not going to put it out there for you to see. And the reality is that in our 24 years, we can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times anything that even appeared reportable came up. So the third potential barrier is language differences. So how do you have a home visit with somebody that when you don't speak the same language? Definitely, we recommend to not let language differences be a barrier to doing home visits and building that relationship. You know, take advantage of your school or your school district's interpretation services, turn to those for help. And then also always ask the family. Again, this is a place where you never want to assume, right? So make sure you ask the family whether they need or want interpretation during that home visit. And oftentimes families themselves have a trusted person that that helps them do translation and interpretation for them. So that's another way to work through that. And then the final one here is on assumptions. And I've mentioned this in different ways, but you know, we all hold assumptions about each other and about things and about processes. And so, and oftentimes we allow those assumptions to stand in the way of doing something different. And so in the training, again, we always encourage educators to do some deep reflection about what really is holding them back. And are they assumptions or are they fact? And is there a way for them to kind of leave those assumptions at the door and try this new practice and see how it works? So those are some of the assumptions or the barriers that we talk about in our training. Now, I do want to say that everything I've talked about so far has held true for 23 years for doing in-person, face-to-face visits. And then, of course, over a year ago, the pandemic hit, and we were faced with the reality that virtually nobody in the country could actually use our model of face-to-face in-person home visits. And so to be quite honest with you, at that time, I kind of was thinking, well, you know, this pandemic will be over in a few weeks and let's just sit it out and we'll start up again where we left off. And of course, I was completely wrong about that. But fortunately, we started hearing pretty immediately from educators in the field, and they told us two things. First of all, they said that their in-person visits before the pandemic made a big difference in easing the transition into remote learning. And then the second thing they told us was that they really, really, really wanted some support in figuring out how to continue to build relationships of trust, even when they could not sit face-to-face with families. And so that was really all we needed to hear. So we sat down and we took a look at our non-negotiable core practices and asked ourselves whether they would still work in a virtual setting. And we discovered that yes, they actually do still hold up even in a virtual setting. And so we developed a training to train people on how to do virtual visits, what we call bridge visits. And then we were able to pilot the actual virtual bridge visit starting in, I think it was June of last year when the first ones happened. And I'm just going to show you this screenshot because this is the very first screenshot that I saw of a virtual bridge visit. And for me, it was a real turning point because you see the expression on people's faces. You can kind of guess at some of the dynamics that are happening during this home visit. And it was just confirmation for me that yes, this model still works, even in a virtual setting. And we've been really pleasantly surprised to see that across the country, so many educators, so many schools and districts have transitioned their in-person home visits into virtual home visits, and they're continuing to build those relationships. And now we have another tool for when, you know, as we continue to kind of open schools and close them and open and close them again, we have another tool to just continue to build those relationships of trust. So that is kind of, again, a whirlwind of information about the background of parent-teacher home visits and our model. And like I said earlier, it's always much more powerful to hear how this all gets implemented in a local community. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Gretchen to share with us how this all works in Sacramento.
Thanks, Gina. So as Gary said, I'm Gretchen Viglione, the parent-teacher home visit training specialist here in Sacramento. Just to tell you a little bit about my personal journey with parent-teacher home visits, I was a classroom teacher for 19 years in a Title I school. I taught kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade. I didn't go beyond third grade. If you see me in person, you'll see that I'm not very tall. And I always felt that if I get above third grade, they're taller than me. And I was just kind of scared of them. So hats off to everybody who is above third grade. You have my utmost respect. About halfway through my teaching career, I was introduced to the model of in-person parent-teacher home visits. And honestly, I was burned out. I didn't feel like I was making a difference. I was discouraged. I was tired. I was cranky. And I found out about parent-teacher home visits from someone who had done this program at her site, and she brought it over to our school. And at first I was sort of resistant to it, but I went on my first home visit and it impacted me so immensely that I started to go on more visits. And the more visits that I started to go on, the more I realized the power of this relational model and what it means to have really authentic relationships with your students and families, and how that impacts the impact that you make with your students back in the classroom. And so I became a real staunch supporter of parent-teacher home visits, both as a teacher and a teacher leader at my school. That one picture is me with one of my classes. So these pictures tell a little story kind of about me. The picture on the left is sort of where my journey came full circle. That's me with one of my students that I had in first grade. And he is one of our city year staff, and he was actually in a training. And so when I walked up and saw him and he said, "Miss Beretta, is that you?" And I said, "Yes." And it was just an amazing to come full circle to, have him as a student and then have him as a training in this program. The middle picture is a home visit that I did with my colleague. And the little girl on the right is actually still in my life, her and her family. I had her in third grade, and then I had her little sister right after her. And the picture on the far right is me at her quinceañera years and years later, from her being in my third grade class. And so that's really what impacted me about this model. These relationships are not only in the moment, but they're lasting, and they lead to understandings about the families I worked with that I would not have had, because they become like family to you. And it really made me want to continue to be a teacher. I did come over and work at National Parent Teacher Home Visits for a couple years, as well as the district. And honestly, at that time, I wasn't sure about leaving the classroom, because these home visits really helped me become passionate about teaching again, passionate about students and families again. And I wasn't sure if I even wanted to leave. Whereas the time when I did my first home visit before that, I was looking for any way out of the classroom. And so it changed me. And that's why I sort of came into this role, because I felt like if any of these, trainings could impact others the way they impacted me, I really wanted to share the message and be part of sharing this message. So that's why it's so meaningful to be here with Gina, sharing this message of home visits and bridge visits. So as I said, it's really the high quality relationships that impacted me as a teacher and led me to all kinds of outcomes that Gina shared earlier in the classroom. And now to see those outcomes happening across the district at our parent-teacher home visit sites, which are kinder through high school. But there are research-based strategies that do create these high quality relationships. And I know as a teacher, I went to a lot of training on curriculum, classroom management, lesson planning, writing school plans, but I didn't get a lot of training on how to build high quality relationships. Now, some of us are just kind of, that is part of our nature, but some of us it's not. And so having this training on parent teacher home visits and learning about this model really helped me know how to have these high quality relationships. This information came out of a slide presented last year at the IEL conference. And these are really the research-based items that contribute to high quality relationships. So first we have the two-way communication. So not just me talking at you and communicating at you, but me providing opportunities where you can communicate back with me. And that's huge in parent-teacher home visits, because so many times we're sending home the notes, we're doing the robocalls, we're putting, letters together, and we're communicating out, but we're not allowing families to communicate back in to us. And so parent-teacher home visits really opens up that opportunity for two-way communication. The listening, another thing that's really big. Again, we're constantly providing information to our families, but are we listening to them and hearing what their needs are? Trust is so huge. There was a lot of things before home visits that I didn't personally understand about trust, about why people did not trust schools, why people did not trust me, even if I didn't have any particular negative experience with them, that there was sort of these foundational things that had happened, to them throughout their lives that caused them to distrust. So really using this model to create that trust with families. Empathy, not only me understanding where families were coming from, but families understanding where I was coming from. Me being able to share with families like, this is what happens when your student comes in late every day and we all have to stop and everyone wants to say hi to them, of course, and then we have to get back on track. And then the next student comes in a few minutes late and the same thing, so families understanding me as well. Cooperation, working together. Awareness of implicit bias, that's kind of, I think, a fairly recent terminology. It wasn't around when I was in teacher school, but really understanding that, we have these biases, even if we don't personally prescribe to them, they're all around us. Leaving those biases behind and not letting them interfere with our teaching. And then really noticing the strengths and assets of our families and not looking at our families like, how can we fix them? But recognizing that all families have assets, all families have strengths, and they bring those to the table, as a family for their student, and really acknowledging that and appreciating that and celebrating that. So the neat thing about parent-teacher home visits, when you think about these components of high-quality relationships, is that they absolutely support every single one of these components. Parent-teacher home visits are really about quality relationships with students and families, not just surface relationships, not just big gatherings where families come onto school and we call it family engagement, but those real high quality relationships. PTHV gives us a model. So if we're not really sure how to do it, if we go to a training and we follow the model as Gina described of the non-negotiables, we can learn how to have those high quality relationships, and just how educators really develop a deeper understanding, like I said, not just for their students, but for their whole communities. So parent-teacher home visits supports all of those. Another piece that's really unique, I think, to parent-teacher home visits versus other programs is that these relationships benefit all staff. So we are designed to have classroom teachers do home visits, our special education and our specialty teachers doing visits, our counselors doing visits, our support staff doing visits, expanded learning doing visits, administrators doing visits, cafeteria people doing visits, office staff, custodians doing visits. So as Gina talked about, we do our visits in pairs, and all of these people are important to kids and their families and their communities. And so this model really includes all those people that are surrounding students and supporting them in doing the visits and building the relationships. So as Gina also shared, we were able to do this model. It was born here in Sacramento and was going along for the last 23 years until COVID hit. And I was like Gina, when I first heard about it, I thought, okay, this will blow over in a couple of weeks. We'll just kind of lay low, work on some projects that we had on the back burner. And then it seemed to be going on and going on. And honestly, I wasn't sure what is going to happen to parent-teacher home visits. And so, as Gina said, it wasn't long. It was very short, within a couple days, that teachers started reaching out and saying, when are we going to get the model for virtual virtual visits. And that's when I reached out to Gina and said, hey, this is what I'm hearing. And she said, yeah, that's what we're hearing at National as well. It sounds like we really need to put something together, which also just speaks to the heart of the program, that this program is so effective for the people that use it and so meaningful for people that take advantage of using it, that right away they knew it was something they needed. We also heard from our teachers that had done the in-person visits, how amazing it was when they went into distance learning versus some of their colleagues, because they got into distance learning right away. And I'll share in a moment a picture of a couple of those teachers. So as Gina said, we thought, what do we do about the 5 non-negotiables? We went through each of those and sort of decided where do they fit in the virtual space, and they all fit in the virtual space. And so we didn't lose any of the power of those 5 non-negotiables that had been around for over 23 years. Then we decided, do we need a training? And so we decided, yes, we absolutely need a training. It is part of our 5 non-negotiables. And then we tried a pilot, both here in Sacramento as well as in Elk Grove, to see what would happen. And quite honestly, not knowing what would happen exactly, I really wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if it was going to be teachers who had always done visits hopping onto the virtual model, if we were going to get some new teachers, if people would go to the training and then kind of say, no, it wasn't exactly what I thought. But if you go on to the next slide, you're going to see a picture kind of what happened here in Sacramento. So these are 2 kindergarten teachers in the top who are very, very dedicated to in-person home visits, and they both visit almost all of their students that will allow a visit prior to school each year, which they did as well last year. And they are 2 teachers that were able to start their distance learning 2 weeks ahead of the district, because their parents immediately started reaching out to them, first of all, checking to see how they were doing, not even checking, expecting anything from the teachers, but wanting to know if the teachers were okay, if their kids were okay, if their families were okay, and then wanting to know, when will we start some type of virtual learning. So these 2 teachers were 2 full weeks ahead of the district and starting their distance learning with very close to 100% attendance with their distance learning. When school began this year and we were solely in the bridge visits model, they embraced it. They conducted their bridge visits with all their families again. They've shared with me some really neat things, like how in the bridge visits model, for example, in this picture, mom is at work and dad and Miss Gia are at home, and they were still able to find a time to have a successful bridge visit. So we found some places, when you do stuff, you find out new things. How the bridge visits did really help with that one barrier of time, as well as allowing people to participate who may not have been able to participate before. So as I said, I wasn't sure what was going to happen, and what has happened has been truly remarkable. What's happened here in Sacramento is that the number of visits has tripled every month beginning in August 2020. And we thought, oh, this will just be a rush for August and September to get school started. Every single month, it's been 3 to 3.5 to even 4 times the number of visits that we've done. So keep in mind, this program was born here, in 96, 98, but this bridge visits have really made a huge impact on reinvigorating people in the importance of relationships. So far this year, we've done over 3,100 visits. Compared to last year, we did about 900, and the year before that, we did about 1,100. And the year's not even over. Usually this time of year, I'm hearing from people, okay, we're done with visits, but not this year. They're still going strong. I just checked on our May visits, and we're still 3.6 times more than previous years. Nearly 40% of those 40 sites have visited 10% or more of their students, another really remarkable statistic for us. And 563 students and support staff have been trained since June. In a typical year, across the entire year, I'll train 200 people and be super excited about it. So to see this number almost triple as well is pretty incredible. Now, I can give you all the statistics that you want, but that's not nearly as important as what are the teachers saying about these visits. So I have some quotes in here from some of our teachers. What's amazing about these quotes is that I don't solicit these. These come in from emails from people just randomly, just wanting to express how much these visits have meant for them and their students and their families. And so when people sort of go out of their way to take the time out to send you an email to let you know how amazing this experience has been, then I really know that it's really meaningful, because it's not me out there asking people how it's going. It's people just pouring in their feedback about the visits. So I'm not going to read all of these today, but I really love the bottom one for high school. A lot of times I'll hear, oh, this is an elementary program, but this is not. This is for all students. Word has started to spread about our check-ins, meaning the visits, and many students are reaching out to schedule visits. The visits have made such an impact on myself as well. I have experienced just about every emotion possible speaking with these families. I feel blessed to have this opportunity. This was from one of our attendance staff at a high school, and she had been doing those attendance type visits where you're calling to find out, where kids are and what do you need. And she switched and started doing these type of visits. And she said, it's just been an incredible experience, and has impacted attendance far more than the other type of visits. So, the results are in. The bridge visits are amazing. And then if you want to hear more about home visits, we do have a website. Here's our parent teacher home visit website. It talks about what we do, our trainings, we have our toolbox. It has all kinds of testimonies and videos, and you can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, I think too. So, sign up for our newsletter. This webinar was advertised on the newsletter, and we love to share more information with you about home visits. So I'm going to turn back to Gina.
Thanks, Gretchen. I had to unmute myself there. Yeah, thank you for sharing that Sacramento story, Gretchen. And you see on the screen here are both of our contact information, and please do feel free to follow us on social media, visit our website. And if you have any questions or you kind of want to think through what it would look like to bring this model to your community, your schools, you can reach out to either one of us. We are happy to talk with you, answer any further questions that don't get answered today. But I do know that Gary is going to lead us in some question and answer now. So I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Gary.
Awesome. Gina and Gretchen, so much I want to cover. There's so many things to just kind of unpack here. I don't think we have all the time to do that, but we've had some questions. So as we're going through this, I'm going to ask a couple questions and I'll get to as many of these possible. So thank you for those that have already submitted your questions. If you want to put yours either in the chat or in the Q&A, I will get to as many of them as possible. But Gina, really quickly, I remember when we were talking about this, 2 years ago, I remember I asked you the question, could you do home visits online? And I think emphatically the answer was no way.
I'm sure that's what the answer was.
So walk me through that, because what was the hesitation to move there, and then what has it been since then? What did you discover as the world was kind of forced to do everything differently? Schools were forced, businesses, restaurants, everyone was in the same boat of, okay, we've got to keep the mission moving forward. How do we do that? Can you walk me through a little bit of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, I'm sure that answer was there's no way we could have done virtual, because that was my mindset, and that was our mindset as an organization, that there was something really special. And I think we still believe that there is something really special about doing an in-person, face-to-face home visit. Like nothing quite replaces that kind of a visit. And yet what we have learned by doing these virtual visits is that you can still build that relationship of trust. And when the pandemic hit, it really forced us to reconsider our position on that. A lot of things contributed to our reconsideration of that. One of them was just the sheer reality that nobody could do our model anymore. Another one was that we started hearing from educators across the country who were saying, please help us figure out how to do this. Another one was just the pandemic itself, and the needs that the pandemic highlighted around needing that connection, needing to that partnership between families and educators. And so we really had to take stock, is it better for us to not do anything because we believe nothing quite replaces an in-person visit? Or is it better for us to adapt to these changing times when we know there's so much need and so much confusion going around, and that communication, that relationship between families and educators is so important. And so those were the things that I think really contributed to us trying. And I have to admit, similar to what Gretchen said, none of us were entirely 100% sure whether the virtual visits were going to work or not. Like, are people even going to do these, and are they going to be valuable? But you heard Gretchen talk about how, and the similar stories repeated across the country about how people have kind of jumped on this. And in some ways, educators who may not ever have felt comfortable doing home visits before, and families who may not have felt comfortable doing home visits before, the virtual visit provided kind of a gateway to start doing visits and building those relationships. And we're hoping that will then lead to additional comfort in doing in-person visits when they are available and allowable as well.
Awesome. Well, I thank you for sharing that. It's been great to watch just the journey and to see the mission continue forward despite the circumstances. So very, very cool. I want to go to a couple questions here. And again, if you have more questions, please put them in the Q&A or chat. But a couple things that kind of stood out to me is, when you were talking about the purpose, and one of the things that you share is we share our hopes and dreams. What an amazing way to put that relationship first. And I remember I was a former teacher. I thought that I was going in there to change the family, so to speak. And what I realized is that the family changed me. And understanding my kids and my families was more about my mindset change than it was about the families. And so I saw that research that you mentioned in there about Johns Hopkins, and how the research effect seemed to have an effect not just for those families and those students, but for the whole school. Is that part of it? Is that very common in your teachers?
Yeah, so we hear just a lot of stories, and Gretchen can kind of speak to this as well, but just a lot of teachers who talk about that same shift in terms of how home visits change them and their outlook on teaching, on how they understand and relate with their students and their families. We don't, that finding from Johns Hopkins about kind of changes at the whole school level, we were surprised to see that finding. We're pleasantly surprised to see that finding. We don't know why we see those changes at the whole school level. And that is, I think, a question for future research. But we do have a theory. We have a theory that we see those whole school changes because home visits change teachers. And when a teacher is in a classroom, they're not just interacting with students they did home visits with, right? They're interacting with all of their students. And so the power of really being able to kind of change the mindsets of teachers and really kind of impact the way that they see their own profession, I think has kind of that ripple effect across entire classrooms and entire schools. And I don't know if Gretchen, you want to say anything about that, but
I just absolutely agree, and it happened for me in my own story. It happens with, as Gary shared, it happens with teachers who really embrace this. And so many of our teachers are going in with, at the training, can I bring this? Does the family need this? And I'm having to tell them, just do a couple and see what happens, and they come back with the same exact words Gary said. The visit changed them. It changed them from the inside out. And that does impact a whole school. I saw a question about how to get teachers on board. And, along that vein is, it's usually one or two teachers that's really passionate and starts this out at any site, and then it spreads. And that even happens here in Sacramento, where we've been the founding district, for over 20 years. So, just feel like it's a mighty team of two can make a huge impact, because people will start to notice the changes in the relationships they have with their students and families.
Awesome, Gretchen and Gina. We've got time for a couple more questions, and some, I'm trying to kind of put these in themes, but there was, you answered the question about how do you get teachers to participate. There was another question as a follow-up to that. As a teacher, you don't target certain students. That seems to be in the model, but the question was from Holly. I understand that students aren't targeted, but is it acceptable to target certain grade levels, or to start, let's say with 6th grade and say that's where we're going to focus? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, good question. So we do support kind of not so much targeting, like I said, individual students or groups of students by these different labels that we put on them. But having a focus, like starting in kindergarten or starting in 5th grade. I think a lot of schools adopt those kinds of practices where they will start with a certain cohort of students to start the practice and then grow it from there. And so a lot of times schools will start at the kindergarten level and kind of grow it so that a student experiences home visits all the way through, which is great. Sometimes they will start with critical transition years, elementary to middle school, or middle school to high school, or high school to after high school, right? And so, so there's different ways to kind of focus your home visits without necessarily targeting certain groups.
Awesome. There was a second question, and then there's a third question I want to get to. So maybe we'll start with this one. The question of what if there is a lot of distrust, maybe on both sides, both from the teacher and the family. And I'm sure this has been, in your work, you've experienced this. What's that way to approach those type of conversations?
Yeah, excellent question. Gretchen, do you want to say a few words about that?
I'm going to say, if you follow the model, the first thing is you're always starting with the willing, and you only need, one willing family to take the chance to do this. And then a lot of times, as I said, just within the teachers, the same thing, it grows. And if you follow our model, if you follow those 5 non-negotiables, and you really follow them, to the letter, you will start to break down those walls, because pretty soon people will realize that you are trying to build a relationship. I've had students where I've had 4 of their children, and on the first student, I said, "Can I do a home visit?" And she said, "No." And the second student, I called again, and she said, "I told you last year, no." And the third student, I called, and she said, "How many times do I have to tell you no?" And by the 4th student, her 4th child, she said, "When are you coming for my home visit?" And I asked her, as I got to know her, why didn't you ever let me come? And she just said, I didn't trust you. I didn't believe you. I didn't believe what you said you were trying to do. But as time went on, and you had 3 of my kids, and, I heard of other families doing visits, I learned that you really meant it. So the main thing, I think, is to really use that model, not to think to yourself, oh, I can change the model and make it better. I can target, I can bring in a bunch of resources. I don't have to talk about hopes and dreams. Hopes and dreams is just an afterthought, but really embracing what this model is meant to do breaks down those barriers and breaks down those walls.
Awesome. Love that. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. One is kind of in the theme of the questions that I'm seeing on there is, you talked about, it's funny because you mentioned the hopes and dreams, and it seems like such a, some might call it a fluffy conversation to talk about with parents. But before we started the webinar, Gina, you were telling me about the foundations of the work and the community building. And it was almost the relationship came first because of the way that they were approaching the model. What they noticed was the results. And and it wasn't the other way around, right? They weren't going after, increase in attendance, decrease chronic absenteeism, increase in performance. That just kind of happened. And it just kind of speaks to that power of the relationship. But how do you sell, your administration on, hey, I want to talk about hopes and dreams with my families.
Yeah.
What's a good first step?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think fortunately for us that there has been a great deal of research on the power of relationships in schools, and kind of what does meaningful family engagement look like in schools. And so some of you might be familiar with the dual capacity framework, which is a great framework. It's dualcapacity.org, I think. A great framework for thinking about family engagement that is really relationship based. And then also just kind of the outcomes. I mean, again, as we were talking before the webinar, you want to reduce chronic absenteeism. And it's really counterintuitive to think, okay, so let's address chronic absenteeism by focusing on relationships. Like, how does that happen? But it really does. And we do have the evidence to support that. And so I think for a lot of administrators and a lot of us these days, we want to see the results. We want to see the outcomes and show that it actually works. And so we have those results. In addition to that, though, I think also just this work at a very human level, when you start talking to people about what their current state of relationships are with families and kind of get to the heart of that, I think I don't know of many or maybe even any educators, whether they're administrators or classroom teachers or whatever their role is, that doesn't want to see greater family engagement, and that intuitively kind of understand the value of it. So I think there's both kind of the research and the data to draw on, but there's also this sense of humanity that I think we can all relate to about the value of relationships.
Absolutely, 100%. We have time for one last question, and this is something we get from time to time. But as a middle school teacher, I was right in between, the elementary and the high school. So we kind of bridged both worlds. But a lot of times you hear, oh yeah, home visits. Those are for those elementary teachers. That really doesn't work. As they get older, they don't really want us involved. Can you talk to us about some of the work that you guys have done at the middle high school level, and what that looked like? What was the effect there?
Yeah, Gretchen, do you want to talk about what that?
Oh gosh, absolutely. So the work in the middle schools and high schools has been amazing because I get that same response in my own district. And I have a few teachers that have moved actually from the elementary space to the middle school space that were big home visit teachers that brought that practice with them. And they even said, I don't even know if middle school kids are going to want to visit, even though they believed in the program. And they have contacted me and said, oh my gosh, you would not believe it. These middle schoolers are more hungry for visits than even elementary kids were. And they want the picture. One teacher always takes a picture when she's on a visit of a selfie. And she's like, the middle school kids want their pictures printed out. They stick it on their binders. They're talking about the visit. She said they start showing up outside your door before school and after school and between classes. And the same thing with the high school and the high school parents, which has also been huge for us. The response from the high school parents just saying, gosh, thank you so much. We feel so disconnected from the school. And the fact that you would just reach out in this informal way is so meaningful for us. And again, as I shared that quote, high schoolers were hearing about visits and actually contacting the teachers and saying, hey, when am I going to get that kind of visit? So, in that time that we think, oh, this is just so cute and it's fluffy, it isn't. Lots of meaningful stories. I wish we had more time, about high schoolers hearing for the first time their parents' hopes and dreams for them, for the first time what their parents did to come to this country and do things to give them opportunities, and high schoolers never having heard that and the impact that has had. So this is absolutely a program for all grades, and middle schools and high schools can be very, very successful.
Awesome. Gina, you said it well, or Gretchen, you said it well. I wish we had more time. This is the end of our time with our family, and we want to be respectful of the hour that we have. But if you want more information We've had a lot of questions, will the PowerPoint be available? When will the webinar, the recording? We will send that out in 24 hours, so you'll have access to all of that content that we just shared through that. Also in there, and we'll make sure we send this in the email, is Gretchen and Gina's contact information. So if you want to learn more about their program, you can definitely do that. And I cannot thank you, family, enough for joining us today. Gretchen and Gina, the power of your work. I can't wait to just spread the word. It's absolutely amazing. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing with our family. And we look forward to having you again at some point. For all of you out there that are finishing up school, have a great summer. Get some rest, and we'll see you when the school year begins again. Thanks so much.